Evaluating the inverse of a function given a graph of the original function. We saw in functions and function notation that the domain of a function can be read by observing the horizontal extent of its graph. We find the domain of the inverse function by observing the vertical extent of the graph of the original function, because this corresponds to the horizontal extent of the inverse function. Similarly, we find that the range of the inverse function by observing the horizontal extent of the graph of the original function, as this is the vertical extent of the inverse function. If we want to evaluate an inverse function, we find its input within its domain, which is all or part of the vertical axis of the original function's graph. Now, if we're given the graph of a function, we want to be able to evaluate its inverse at specific points. Step 1, we want to find the desired input on the y-axis of the given graph. Step 2, we're going to read the inverse function's output from the x-axis of the given graph. So for example 6, we're evaluating a function and its inverse from a graph at specific points. So a function g of x is given in figure 5. We want to find g of 3, and then we want to find g inverse of input 3. So if we want to find the first part, g of 3, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to start at the value at x equals 3, which is the input. And then we want to find the output at when x is equal to 3. So the output is the number 1, because that is the one that corresponds to the input 3, the ordered pair 3, 1. Now when we want to find g inverse of 3 equals 5, well, g inverse of 3 tells us that we now need to start at a y value of 3, and then we need to find out what is the input. Well, the input is the value of 5 when the y value is 3. So we start at the y equals 3 output and then find input when y is equal to 3. Now, again, to evaluate g of 3, we find 3 on the x-axis and find the corresponding output value on the y-axis. The point 31 tells us that g of 3 is equal to 1. To evaluate g inverse of 3, recall that by definition, g inverse of 3 means the value of x for which g of x is 3, meaning that the output is 3. So by looking for the output value 3 on the vertical axis, we find the point 5, 3 on the graph, which means that the input is 5, so g of 5 is equal to 3. So by definition, g inverse of 3 is equal to 5.